very glad to be here and have possibilities to speak to you. Of course, I have the honor to introduce an outstanding Polish poet. And you listened also essayist, researcher of literature and history, author of several books, poetry books, but not only. Professor at the Institute of Slavic Literatures and Languages of the Polish Academy of Science, and a high school teacher for many years. Joanna speaks German very well and had lectures at Berlin University. Yes, of course.
Humboldt University.
Yes, and she is interested in the subject of the Holocaust and post-Holocaust literature and documents. Her early work focused on experiments with language, but for a long time she has been practicing a kind of discrete intimates. Her poetry books are usually very precisely constructed. They form compact cycles and wholes, and the lyrical confession struggles with something that in Polish poetic tradition is called shame of feelings. From the arised the extraordinary tension of her poems. Joanna Roszak, maybe we start from the reading of poetry, please.
Why not? Hello there, and let me start by saying once again that it is a great experience to be here. The poems belong to the language in which they were written, so I decided to read it first in Polish and only then in my translation into English, so you can follow the musicality of Polish language. And many of my favorite poems of my own, I can't read here because they are untranslatable. And to demonstrate this issue, I beginning with the poem entitled Om. It is of course the sacred syllable, you know it's better than me, but the Polish word dom, home, differs from one letter at the beginning from the Om. Fortunately, in the English word home, we have these two letters too. So first, in Polish. Om. Przy medytacji nad domem uparcie brakuje litery. Na tym samym grzebyku włosy 3 pokoleń. I igły, i liście, i sierść psa. Nabraliśmy wprawy w rysowaniu domów i wyczesywaniu zwierząt. Ach, śpi, kochanie. Zakładam ci buty, zakładam ci buty, zakładam ci buty. Om. While meditating on home, 2 letters are missing. On the same comb, the hair of 3 generations, and needles, and leaves, and dog's hair. We've become proficient in drawing houses and combing animals. Oh, sleep, my baby. I'm putting your shoes on. I'm putting your shoes on. I'm putting your shoes on. Odchylenie. Zdążyło się ściemnić przed terminem ważności, a skrupulatnie zbierałam twoje włosy. Z dywanów, mebli i umywalki, żebyś nie zauważył, że się starzejemy. Ty zbierałeś moje, żeby było czysto. Deviation. It had gotten dark before the expiry date. But I collected meticulously your hair from carpets, furniture, and sink. Lest you notice that we're getting old. You collected mine to keep the place clean. Yak, and this is a poem in English like house, a poem which takes me to my childhood. I used to live in high-rise apartment, and every morning a milkman picked up an empty bottle of milk and he replaced it with the filled one. Jak? Być jak tajemniczy mleczarz z dzieciństwa, podmieniający butelkę pod drzwiami. Brać puste, zostawiać pełne. Stoimy przed każdą stroną świata przez minutę w ciszy. Likewise. To be like a secret milkman from childhood, changing the bottle outside the door. To take empty, to leave filled up. We are facing every side of the world for a minute in a silence. Jasne szkliwo. Ryzykownie byłoby śledzić podkreślenia w twoim egzemplarzu mojej książki. Bright glaze. It would be risky to follow underscores in your copy of my book. And the next one, only in English, dark glaze. But it's even riskier to open my book taken out of your shelf and notice uncut pages. Quagga. Naked animals dressed from inside. The absence list. In the end of the alphabet, quagga. In a few years, we'll start reading the newspaper with the obituaries. May people grow back in a city like grass on the ground. And this poem came to me in the Natural History Museum in Berlin. Then among another stuffed animals, I saw quagga, a half-striped zebra, the species that died out. Love saves, or at least a tender touch, like when you found us a tumor in the breast. Fleur. Footprints in front of the house. Animal or human. The buried bells ripen. The anthills are still asleep. Animals don't put their hands on people's heads. The rain smells of earth. More and more visible. On folded cards, traces of human and animals overlap. Nothing forest is alien to us. We look behind each other to see a safer past. Mixed, deciduous, coniferous. On the way over the sprayed stones, uncovered sky, uncovered lands, and water. The whole world was in everything. The whole world there is in everything. Long ago and near, and it is a poem connected with Radio Free Europe that broadcasts in these areas where the free flow of information is disturbed. And I know this Radio Free Europe from my childhood too. Long ago and near. Look for me so greedily, like Grandpa was searching the Radio Free Europe when I was falling asleep in the next room. The next one is entitled Burning Hot, and this poem refers to the well-known woodcut depicting a woman who cut off a part of her kimono because the cat is laying on it, and I have my own cat for since 5 weeks. She's named Surya. So I'm thinking about her now. Burning hot. A woman cuts off a hem of kimono so as not to wake up her cat sleeping on it. There's something about tenderness here. Come up, man, gain kitty, and fall asleep tightly, knowing better what is it all about. Next one is entitled Sundoku. It is Japanese word for phenomenon, books we have on our, for example, night table in a pile, and we don't have time to read it. Sundoku. It's August. Winter is coming and waves into the unknown. Maybe that's enough for a poem. It's worth writing it for the one word. And maybe the last one in this set. This is a poem written 3 years after my grandma died, and I took from her cellar her china and invited my family to serve the dishes on this porcelain. But first I had to wash every single plate and every single cup in my hands. I didn't want to use dishwasher to not destroy this wonderful decorative patterns, and of course to once again say goodbye to my grandma. Boy. Stains on the porcelain taken over after her death. I am replaying her last wash. Cups and plates mismatched. The set table. The water splits. The ocean falls apart.
Thanks. I have a question first. You are extremely attentive to language, especially your first books focused on language, which was the topic and the material of them, these poems. How do you feel reading your poetry in English? Is still your poems?
Yeah, this is a brilliant question. Maybe that's why I decided to translate these poems on my own, to feel here in India that I am really reading my own poems, because these poems translated into English or German by Lin Such or Bertrand Hartmann are really interesting for me, but at the same time they are, to be honest, a little bit foreign, maybe. And yes, I think I'm really immersed in language, but this new one are maybe not so strongly connected with the word of reading. I think that the path is rather another experience. That's my experience as a reader. So I am reading here my freshest poems, because this first one was really hard to translate. And for example, my debut was entitled Tintinabuli. This word in Latin means the bells, and I borrowed it from Estonian composer Arvo Pärt. And his compositional style, Tintinabuli, he called it this way. It is one line, and then it is doubled and tripled, and I wanted to adapt it in my poems. It's really hard to translate. The next one was entitled Lele, and for me, the sound in this first poems was very, very important, crucial. Now it is not so important, I think. So, of course, we can't keep this sound in another language. For example, the second volume was entitled Lele, and for me it is really meaningless word. And then I Googled it after printing the book, and it occurred that there is a language called Lele in Democratic Republic of Congo. So yeah, sometimes the book is smarter than an author, the poem is smarter, the poem knows more than author, and for me it is great.
In literature which you read, you are interested in borderline situations, both ethical and aesthetic. For instance, the Holocaust and living under the weight of its memory, especially Paul Celan, Nelly Sachs, Ingeborg Bachmann. These are authors very important for you. Also, you are interested in formal experiments, linguistic, intermedia, hypertext. How does your own writing situate itself against these borderlines?
Indeed, these historical catastrophes are world-shaking, and they affect the literature. So I remember what a breakthrough it was for me, first meeting as a girl with poetry by Polish author Tadeusz Różewicz, who had written that with every poem he wanted to try to write poetry after Holocaust. So it is one part of answer to your question, and you mentioned experiments, hypertext, this text branching and unfolding on the screen. I was interested in this part of literature really deeply, but then I realized that very often this visual part is more important than the message. So now they are crucial for me when the experimental side is supporting the meaning. And of course, poetry could be this field when we treat it like a repository of some kind of memory or extinct or rare species. I think about these catastrophes, but also about eco-poetry in this hard time of climate changes. But poetry is also a gate when we can find a tranquility or inner peace, and this part of poetry is for me maybe the more important. I remember an aphorism about poetry by author from Chicago, Carl Sandburg. He had written that poetry is a diary of sea animal living on earth and wanting to fly. So, of course, like this only writing species on earth and reading, we have this dream to push boundaries and make experiments all the time. And to be honest, when I'm thinking now about this contemplative part of this art of writing, which is for me the most important now, I think it is a part of my spiritual life. I noticed that there are a lot of commonplaces, for example, yoga and poetry, and every time I build this wisdom mudra, building by touching index finger and thumb, I make the same gesture like when I hold pencil or a pen between these two fingers, and I think I feel the same. So now yeah, I take from poetry this kind of tranquility, and I hope I give it to my readers too.
Yes, I see. And you hope and you believe, maybe, in that certain values must be upheld and not allowed to degenerate. The most important of them is respect for people in dire need, mainly refugees. You wrote poems about them, about refugees. Do you believe that poems can awaken the conscious?
Ryszard Krynicki, a Polish, my beloved author, wrote a short poem, but poems will not convert at this spot. Unfortunately, this also applies to good poems. It is, of course, hard for us. I didn't want to overestimate the role of literature, but on the other side, I think it is a gate to know an inspiration or sometimes even knowledge, but we can't rely on one poem or even one book. For example, Steve Jobs, who in 1974 went to India, was sure that he will be enlightened here, that one journey will give him to it, and yeah, he realized after the trip that it wasn't so smart. And maybe the same thing is with one poem or even a one book. Malala said it can change the world. Yeah, maybe it can, but it is a starting point. Yeah, I wrote a book about refugees, especially from Syria, because it is this time in Europe when they were knocking to our doors, and our government had the attitude that we couldn't open the door. So we manifested and gathered money for them, especially to Aleppo at the time. And now I think that I wrote this book because nothing more was available. I started with deeds and I reached for a poem where nothing more was available for me. And it is fair and it is ethical because, you know, there is our surname and name on the cover. So maybe it would be unethical to write a poem or a book about refugees and do only this. It is too less.
To save the peace, it is another your mission, not only your writing. And I think that in your perspective, peace is a key to future, is fundamental value. But I want to and have to ask you about the war in Ukraine. Has the war in Ukraine changed anything in your world view? Can war be justified?
I can imagine war and justice, this connection. War is some kind of collective madness, and we in Poland for sure live in a culture which idealizes the war, I think. Still in our set books to Polish literature or history, we have a lot of place devoted to generals and wars, and sometimes even single word about peace activists or Nobel Peace Prize laureates or climate change or women. I teach in school, as you mentioned at the beginning of our meeting, and in March, kids from Ukraine joined to our classes. Among them, for example, Anastasia, I think maybe 25 kids from Ukraine now in my classes, I teach. Last week we organized at school a recipe contest for kids, and Anastasia chose a poem by Krzysztof Kamil Baczyński. It is a Polish writer, Polish poet who died in the Second World War and Warsaw Uprising. And believe me, I had goosebumps listening to her. One of our set books is Pan Tadeusz, Mr. Tadeusz, the last foray in Lithuania. And this very, very long book opens with the words Litwo, ojczyzno moja, ty jesteś jak zdrowie. In English it is something like Lithuania, my homeland, you're the health alone, your word can only be known by someone who lost you. And my Polish students are really so bored with this text, but Anastasia from Ukraine was crying listening to this first lines of this text. So I think that a part of our even Polish literature actualize now.
Yes. Come back to literature, European literature, Central, Eastern Europe, because in some senses we are, they represent this region, this kind of writing. What European poets do you read? Who would you recommend it to readers, poetry readers in India?
Of course, I read, it is maybe a shame, especially European literature, but I am prepared to this topic because we celebrate now in Poland Wisława Szymborska's year because of anniversary. There is a century after her, after she was born near Poznań when we are living with Piotr. So to be honest, I have her text with myself, and with a pleasure I will read here Wisława Szymborska, and I totally recommend to reading her poetry. She's known as Mozart of poetry in Poland, although she had written maybe 350 poems, and when asking why so few, she responds that she has can trash in her home. So maybe.
Yes.
Okay, so
do
I will find a cat in an empty apartment. It is her pearl. I didn't mention that she is a Polish literature Nobel Prize winner. So it is Wisława Szymborska, translated by Claire Kavanagh, and a poet and translator eminent from Poznań, Stanisław Barańczak. Cat in an empty apartment. Die? You can't do that to a cat. Since what can a cat do in an empty apartment? Climb the walls, rub up against the furniture. Nothing seems different here, but nothing is the same. Nothing's been moved, but there's no more space, and at night time no lamps are lit. Footsteps on the staircase, but they are new ones. The hand that puts fish on the saucer has changed, too. Something doesn't start at its usual time. Something doesn't happen as it should. Someone was always here, then suddenly disappeared and stubbornly stays disappeared. Every closet's been examined. Every shelf has been explored. Excavations under the carpet turned up nothing. A commandment was even broken. Papers scattered everywhere. What remains to be done? Just sleep and wait. Just wait till he turns up. Just let him show his face. Will he ever get a lesson on what not to do to a cat? Sidle toward him as if unwilling, and ever so slow on visibly offended paws, and no lips or squeals, at least to start.
Thanks. Anyone more?
I regret it wasn't mine.
Yeah.
I have my poems too. To be honest, I took Barańczak because maybe it is fair to read his translation, Wisława Szymborska's poem, and his own really great text. Very moving for my Ukrainian student too. So Stanisław Barańczak, if porcelain, then only the kind. If porcelain, then only the kind you won't miss under the shoe of a mover, of a thread, of a tank. If a chair, then not too comfortable, lest there be regret in getting up and leaving. If clothing, then just so much as can fit in a suitcase. If books, then those which can be carried in a memory. If plans, then those which can be forgotten. When the time comes for the next move to another street, continent, historical period, or world. Who told you that you were permitted to settle in? Who told you that anything would last forever? Did no one ever tell you that you will never in a word feel at home?
I'm very grateful that you present other poets, because, you know, it's a scene of special poetry brotherhood. But time to read yours.
Okay.
Poem.
Thank you. So maybe now in Polish and then in English about yoga. Lekcja jogi dla średnio zaawansowanych. Gdzie są moje stopy? Gdzie dłonie na przestrzał? Gdzie głowa, skoro nie zawieszona za oknem? Łopatki, dłonie, barki, dusze, nie tutejsze. Szmuglujemy ciała między światem a ognistym dominium. Oddychamy, parujemy. Stajemy na głowie, by dusza wróciła na własne miejsce. Intermediate yoga class. Where are my feet? Where are my hands bullet hole? Where the heads, if not hung outside the window? Blades, hands, shoulders, souls, discomposed. We smuggle bodies between the world and a fury dominion. We breathe, we steam, we stand on heads so that the soul returns to its place. And maybe two poems translated by Lin Su. Nieruchomość. Ludzie powinni dobierać się w pary, by nie zasypiać pojedynczo. Pary są parami na sen, na pewno. Powiedziałam mu, że tężeje jak beton, że się topi jak tiul i że o tym wie. Still life. People should pair up to keep from sleeping alone. Couples are couples for sleeping, for certain. She told him she sets like concrete, she sings like suede, and she knows it's true. And now one of my so-called refugee poems, papilarne. Na ludzi z innego plemienia patrzymy tak, by zrozumieli, że chcemy być tu z nimi. Patrzysz na nas tak, jakbyś chciał, byśmy zostali. 2 wiersze. Jeden uchodźczy, drugi miłosny. Sekundę od błyskawicy do grzmotu zostaje tylko dziadek do kamieni, rozsypana sól, szczelnie zapisane zeszyty w linie papilarne. Papillary. We look at people from another tribe like they understood we want to be here with them. You look at us like you wanted us to remain. 2 poems, one about refugees, the other about love. 1 second from the lightning to the thunder, all that remains is the rock cracker, the scattered salt, the notebooks hermetically scrawled in the papillary ridges.
Thanks a lot. It's time to questions, please. No question.
Does anybody from the audience have any questions?
20 minut. Because people are so hardly, deeply listening to your poetry and don't want to break this reading. Please read some more.
Okay. With pleasure, of course. Lantana. You still burn slowly, while their twisted arbors pushed over piles. Linen lantana and a sharp glow. In a dead sea, on the very surface, a wave will prick us. Disconnection. A white dove is falling gently. One remembers the other with clumsy, cuneiform writing. At the break of a day, at the break of a next year's word, in a small hotel with no paper, with no daybreak. Wave. You feed the ragged waves, a feeder floats, swelled up, swept clean, sleek, squall, sleet. Plagiarizing the experience of mankind. We were already those people who lost details and were not good at collecting live news. We were also shaking where movement of paprikator is studied. We were submersive. We were women without children. We were inclined to suspect that on this planet everyone is running from the tropic of cancer. We were a mother and a father who never stopped being afraid. We were a sleepless station and a sleepless night. We used to be literal because we wanted to be faithful. We did not listen to translated theorists. We were someone for whom stations are meant, not airports. We were the ones who didn't stop at Stradivarius when Joshua Bell was playing for an hour in the subway station. On those who slept on the floor by the sick bed and they didn't finish the story. And those who encouraged exceptions every day. And those people in the picture sitting on a bench in front of a house by the blue coffin. We were a disintegrating herd who learned to read too quickly, wanderers who join and separate and understood that all syllables are composed into the consuming names of death. We lived in poorer neighborhoods outside the wars. We cried the music from Schindler's List. We peeked surreptitiously into other people's sick cards, telling a lie with blank pages. We dried the wood in the wind. Storms raised us. We were hospital infants, water from a spoonful those who no one visits, and drivers of wild dogs at the edge of the road, and vast snows, and a she-wolf who hides puppies in the residence of the polar station, and those who go in the front row behind the coffin and hear what people talk about at the funeral. We were just like that. It was our appearance that burned down. We spread our hands haphazardly as they are before us, and we are trying to know that it is a simply repetition of things. Rwa. To wszystko trwało popadając w beztrawie. Małe Żeremia i lęgowe budki składały się w najprawdziwszy dokument bycia, katalog bliższy i dalszy. I w tych warunkach trwanie zdawało się rozległe, w każdym razie rozleglejsze niż jego przeciwieństwo. A jednak coś spytało, co jest przeciwieństwem światła i nie jest ciemnością. Sciatica. It all lasted falling into desolation. Small lodges and nesting boxes they considered to the truest document of a being, upstream and downstream catalog. And under these conditions, the duration seemed to be extensive, at least more extensive than its opposite. But something asked what is the opposite of light, and is not darkness. Polowanie. Znów zdaje się trwać tamto lato. Sen ma kształt domu, dom kształt budki dla ptaków i psiej budy. I tak trwa. W pochopnie przełamanej literze, przy pustym dzbanku poezji, pełnym dzbanku życia. To flaga domu. Jeden z jej brzegów. Hunting. It feels like summer again. The dream is shaped like a house. House has shape of bird and dog houses. And so it lasts. In a hastily broken letter, with an empty pot of poetry and a full jug of life. It's our house flag, one of its shores.
Again, maybe somebody wants to speak with Joanna. If not, I am very grateful. Thank you a lot for this beautiful reading and interesting reflections about literature and your work. Thank you for attention and goodbye.
Thank you, Piotr. Thank you all.